Cam here from Xano Support, and today we're going to go ahead and get started on querying our data, as well as manipulating it with our function stack, and we'll also explore how to edit data, and maybe even a little bit of deleting. So let's go ahead and get started. So hopping back into the to-do list, what are we doing here? Well, we're going to be querying data. You can see that this data is aggregated. Looks like we have our dates, the aggregated information, all of the actual tasks. We have a toggle switch to show completed tasks or all of the tasks, and a subscribe button if this is not your task. Then also on your page, you'll have the ability to see all of the same information, as well as edit, delete, and complete your task. So to get started, we're going to head into Xano. And what we're looking for is the query all task records. You can create your own custom endpoint, but we're going to keep it simple. So for this, what I want to do is leverage the user data table, the username column. So we're going to load the username into this endpoint, or we're going to send it into this endpoint. We're going to use that information to find the right user, find the right task list, and then load all of the appropriate tasks. So let's start with a text input called username. And another thing that we can also think about adding here for our inputs is this show active or show all. It's a toggle switch, which is just a Boolean field or a true false. So we'll go ahead and add that as well. Let's select Boolean and we'll say show completed. Perfect. The next thing that we're going to do is want to get that user of that username. So let's go ahead and do just that. Under database requests, get the record of our user. And I'm going to change the field name to our username. So we're searching the username column using the username input, and we'll click save. I'll drag that up above, and what I'll do is I'll add a precondition down below that if that username doesn't exist, we'll just return a 404 and say, hey, this user doesn't exist. So I've added a precondition, and that condition is going to be checking if my user1, and I'm adding a filter here, is empty. This filter is going to return a true or false, whether or not that user object is empty or null or 0 or false, anything of the sort. What we have the ability to do is change our operators, and I can say is not using this exclamation equals. So is not empty, or is not true rather, and we'll click save. Here for our error message, we can say this user doesn't exist, and we can copy and paste them into the payload. Our error type will be not found, and we'll click save. So if this user isn't found, then we'll throw this error. If they are, we should just be able to return our tasks. So you can see I have Cameron's username here, and if I run it, that user does exist. But if I change this to just Cam, that user doesn't exist. So perfect. Let's go ahead and just ensure that we have a username that we can pass in to test. Now, beyond that, we want tasks only relevant to this user. Specifically, what we're trying to do is find tasks relevant to the user, relevant to their task ID, or their task list ID. If we go ahead and head to this add-on, what we can do is we can select, let's just create a new add-on. So we'll create a new add-on and we'll select it from our to-do list, and we'll select a single item, and we'll say that we're mapping the to-do underscore list user ID with this user's user ID. So we'll call it to-do list of user, and I'll actually add v2 here just for distinction, and we'll remove this underscore, and it should automatically be mapped for us. So I'll click done, and I'll click save, and I'll click run again, and no errors were thrown. So let's just double check real quick what our user is returning. So if I go to the debug and look at our user, we can see that the to-do list of user v2 is returning our list information with the ID of 1. Perfect. So I'm going to copy this here. So we have our user1.todo underscore list of user underscore v2, then .id to get that actual list ID. The reason we want that is because when we click on this query all records, we want to go ahead and, configure our query so that it's only getting those relevant tasks. So we'll select the tasks.todo underscore list underscore ID, and it needs to equal our user1.todo list of user v2.id. And we'll click save and save. When we run this, we should get all of the results relevant to this user. So perfect. The next thing that we're going to want to do, though, is we are going to want to change the way that this data looks. This in list form is going to look different than how we want it grouped by dates here. And so the way that we're going to go ahead and change that is by selecting our query all records. We're going to go ahead to our output and click on this blue pencil next to our return, where we'll change it to aggregate. We'll have it grouped by our due date. We'll call it tasks due date, and we'll aggregate it by the order. And we'll say that it will be in to-list ascending form. So we'll go ahead and click save and save. And so keep in mind, this is what it looks like now. If we run again, it changes pretty dramatically. So what we have here is an aggregated or grouped data. So in this particular object, within this array, we have tasks that are going to fall under this due date, and we have tasks that are going to fall under this due date. The next thing that we're going to want to do, at least the way that I'd want to approach this, is by changing our dates to reflect what it shows on the wireframe. We can do this by updating our variables, but this isn't an array, so we need to actually iterate through all of these items in the array to do so. We'll go ahead and add a loop here underneath our query all records. And the list that we're going to be iterating over will be our tasks. So let's select tasks, and we'll call each task a task. Inside here, we're going to be updating our variable. So I'm adding an update variable function inside this loop. And what we're going to be updating is each task dot tasks due date. So task dot tasks due date. And what are we actually doing? We have a filter, a very cool filter called format timestamp right here. That's going to convert a timestamp into a human readable format. We can go ahead and supply this format, and it changes this date here as well into a more human readable kind of format. So the way that we can get this data and how to format it is through the PHP sort of like glossary that we have here. And we're going to be providing characters that are going to convert what we're essentially passing into this format on the right-hand side. So left-hand side shows the characters that we can pass in. The right-hand shows the output. The format here is going to be capital F space lowercase j, capital S, comma, space, capital Y. You also have a time zone that you can go ahead and manipulate if you'd like, but we're going to keep it simple and just keep it UTC. So we'll click save and run again. And you can see here that our task due date has now adjusted to match what it looks like in our wireframe. Perfect. The next thing that we're going to need to do is iterate through each of these arrays within the main parent item that we're looping through, and we need to now go ahead and get the appropriate task to load. The way that we'll do that is by adding another loop. So it's a loop inside of a loop. And what we're going to be looping through is the task.tasks order. So let's go ahead and add that here. And we can call it item, or we can call it order, whatever helps you out. But for the sake of this, we'll call it order. As we're looping through it, now what we need to do is get all of the appropriate tasks. The appropriate tasks we'll retrieve via query all records. We'll search our tasks, and we're going to configure our query to look at particular things. So first, we'll start with the easiest, the order. The order is the item that we're currently iterating over. So we'll just say the tasks.order needs to equal the current order that we're iterating over. And we're also going to want to make sure that this is the right date. So tasks.due date, it needs to equal our task.due date. And then in this case, we can go ahead and write out task. I'll click save here for just a moment. I'll copy the tasks due date because that's the column that we're searching against. So the tasks.due date needs to equal the task.tasks_due date. We'll click save and just run this again real quick. We haven't done anything, but no errors is good. The last thing that we want to do is just make sure that this is associated with the right task list. So what we'll do is we'll select the tasks.todo_list_ID, and we'll then get the same list from our user here. So user1 dot to-do list of user v2 dot ID, and click save and click save. After we get this data, so we're getting this record here, we're going to add it to this task order. So what this looks like is an update variable. So we'll go ahead and click update variable. Our existing variable, or the item that we are going to be updating with this new value, is that order item that we're iterating over. So we're essentially saying, yep, we're going to take this item and replace it with more data. It looks like our return variable here for our query all records is task1. So we'll just keep that as task1 for each order item. We're going to replace it with the found record, and click save and run again. What we see here is that we have an array and an array, so we might need to adjust this. Let's go to query all records. We're going to go to our output, and clicking this blue pencil, we're going to switch it from list to single. We run it again. Now it's a little easier to look at here. Perfect. So we actually have now all of the information that we need. The only thing that's missing, I think, is that when we're querying all of our records from our tasks, we're not asking if we want to show completed or not. So I'll click on step 3, to query all records from our tasks, and I'll just make sure that I add an and I'll select our completed equals our show completed. That is, if we go ahead and run this again, perfect. So none of these tasks have been completed. So I'm saying show completed is false. I'm not looking to see completed tasks, essentially. So one thing that we do need to factor in is whether or not we're showing the completed Boolean. The way I like to go ahead and proceed with whether or not it's exclusive or inclusive filtering is actually by introducing a conditional. I just find it a lot easier to implement instead of introducing like any new parameters. So what we'll do under our precondition, we will add a conditional. And in this conditional, we're just going to be checking, is show completed true? Because if show completed is true, we're just going to drag our tasks here into the then we can go ahead and clone this task and add it into our else. And the reason we're going to be adding or modifying this statement is because if show completed is false, that means we should be excluding all of the completed tasks, which means we'll add an and, we'll say completed equals false. What this now does is allows us to run again. So you can see I have a task that I have completed. I actually did recently just adjust that. And then we also have this show completed equals true. So if we run it again, we get all of our values, all of the information. So just let's do a little recap here to make it make sense. We have our get record from user. We're going to be going ahead and getting our data and getting our to-do list of that user using this add-on. From there, we're simply just checking if that user exists. If that user doesn't exist, we're going to throw an error. If that user does exist, we'll proceed, and we want to check, are we asking for whether or not things have been completed? Because if things have been completed, that means essentially we're saying, let's go ahead and show everything. So we're just going to make sure that this is the task that belongs to us or this user. Otherwise, if we are saying that the tasks show completed is false, that means, well, we don't want those in our query. So we need to tell the system tasks.completed equals false. Get us all of those records where the tasks haven't been completed yet. These would be like our active records. From there, we're going to keep the same names so that we can then use the tasks variable and the rest of the logic where we're going to go ahead and update that due date. And of course, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we want to ensure that these query all records are going to be aggregates. But from there, we update the date. Then we loop through each record within this array and we take the order and we say for each order, let's go ahead and find the appropriate task of this list, of this user, of this due date. And we then get that data and update it so that at the end, it looks like this, where we have an array of multiple items, of multiple groupings with the tasks involved. So we'll go ahead and click publish, and we have now completed the ability to successfully query our tasks. So if we show active, this is going to be what we're saying, no, we don't want to see any that have been completed. We want to see all the ones that need to be completed. And then our show all is saying, yes, show everything, even the ones that have been completed. We're going to revisit the subscription in just a second. What we're going to do is move forward on the edit and delete as well as completed aspect. So let's go ahead and do that. So to edit our tasks, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our tasks within our API group, and we're going to find the patch. So this is a traditional method that more along the line says we're editing something. So we'll click it open and we can see that we already have the edit record tasks created for us. Awesome. So if we click it open, we get to see that, well, it's going to update with all of these inputs. Now, sometimes you're going to be editing information where these inputs aren't here, and we don't want to reset our data. So let's go ahead and run this real quick. And what we're going to want to do is find a task that we can pass in. So let's head to our database. We'll go to our tasks, and it looks like task ID 1 will be what we proceed with. So let's go ahead and make sure that we're authenticated as this user and pass in task 1. So keep in mind, this task had information. It had a task name, a description, and so on. So if we click run, you can see that we've updated all of that information. We've edited it. That information is no longer there. So how can we ensure that when we're editing something, even if we're not passing in our inputs, that it doesn't erase our inputs unless there's, well, inputs to update? Click on this edit record and it pulls open this panel. And what we're going to do is we're going to leverage our expressions. This is probably the easiest way to proceed. You can see that this changed from input.toDoList_ID. What we're going to do is introduce this expression syntax. You can see that what we've done is introduced a filter as well as then a ternary operator or operation that's going to say, we're going to update it if this is true. Otherwise, if it's not true, we're going to do something else. And so what we're saying here is that in our input.toDoList_ID, if it is empty, so if that equals true, then we're going to take this item and we're going to take its column. And we're just going to provide its column. Otherwise, what we're going to do is then supply the input value. So we're just going to go ahead and update everything else. So what you'll see is that I just updated task name with the same expression as up above. If we highlight it and then select Command D or Control D in this case, we then highlight all of them simultaneously. So you can see here, we highlight Command D, and now we can type in task name all in one fell swoop without having to update everything else. It does look like this guy here was not captured, which is a little interesting. So we'll go ahead and just update him. And we'll move on to our description where we'll paste what we have up above, highlight Command D or Control D, and type in description. For some reason, it is not liking the following. It should be updating all of them all at once. That is a little interesting, but no worries, nothing that we can't overcome. So we'll go ahead and just continue on with this expression. We're going to proceed down all of our columns and update all of these values. And click save. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a task name. I'm going to go ahead and say task number 1. This is a test, and give it the order of 1. It needs to be formatted in ISO 8601 format. So let's provide it a string of 2024 05 15 and completed. It's showing as a 0. It's the same as saying false. So we'll just click run again. You can see this information's updated, but what happens if we remove this task name? So if we go ahead and click run again, it hasn't updated because we haven't actually supplied a value, so it doesn't need to update. Again, what we're saying in this logic here, we're actually checking the input itself and asking, is it empty? Because if it is empty, if it's true, then what we should do is take the value from the actual record itself. Otherwise, let's use the actual input. And so this expression, it simplifies what we need to do, because prior to this, we'd have to get a record, we'd have to update a variable, and then we'd have to use some set filters, and it would just make the process a lot longer. But using this expression syntax allows us to do it all in one function. So we don't actually have to do anything too crazy. It's my favorite hack. If there's anything that you learn from this, it's that the expression syntax is super powerful. So that's how you edit your records. But we also have in our wireframe the ability to delete and the ability to, of course, complete. Let's just double check our delete task. And before we do that, let's just publish this real quick. And so we just want to make sure that that pre-middleware is attached when we run and debug this. If we select Cameron here, the user of this, and say test task number 1, because it did reset, it looks like. And we need to provide this 8601 format date. So 24/15, we'll say 16, click run. Cool, that's updated. Chris is an admin. So if we select Louis and try to run, it's working. Perfect. And so this is how you edit your tasks, leveraging the expressions, your middleware, and all. The next thing that we need to do is take a look at how we can complete a task. And so what I'd like to do is introduce a custom endpoint. So we're going to add a custom endpoint by, in the top right-hand corner, selecting add an API endpoint and our custom endpoint. What we'll say is that this will just be a completed. Now, we have the ability as well to introduce dynamic content, such as the task ID, as you have seen there in my autocomplete. What we're doing is creating an endpoint and saying this is going to be a variable, this task ID. Let's go ahead and set it to a post, and authentication will be enabled for the user authentication. We'll click save. First and foremost, we are going to want to provide a task ID. So we'll go ahead and click on this blue plus sign for our inputs, add a table reference, and say tasks. So we have our tasks ID that's been populated. Perfect. From there, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and edit our tasks. So we'll go ahead and edit our record. we'll then look at our tasks. What we're going to do is select the ID, the field value of that input, and then scroll down and select completed, turn the eyeball on and select true. We can go ahead and publish it. Don't forget to make sure that your middleware here has been enabled for security. Click save and then publish again, but we did it. So we've created this custom endpoint here very easily. We've created our own name and then supplied a variable and said, well, we're going to be passing in a tasks ID. This tasks ID is going to be an input here. And then when a user has completed their task or they click on that checkbox, this endpoint is going to be triggered. We're going to send over that task ID, and then we're going to find it within our data table and mark it as completed. So, perfect. We have the ability to get the data. We have the ability to edit the data. We have the ability to complete the data. The last thing before we move on to the subscriptions is just deleting the data. So if we go to our delete tasks or this endpoint here, you are going to want authentication enabled. You are going to want to ensure that your pre-middleware has been created. And then what we have the ability to do is, well, not much. We really don't need to do a whole lot, but we can change the response. So Xano allows us to create a custom response if we want. And what I like to do is add these two little curly brackets to create an object and then add a semicolon in between. And it automatically populates this text editor where we can then go ahead and provide keys and values. So I'm just going to say status is deleted with filters, and I'll click save. So that way, when I go ahead and run this as me, I can go ahead and click run, and I get that status has been deleted. If I go to my database and I go to my tasks and I look at ID 1, no longer there, so that's perfect. I'd like to make sure that the pre-middleware is working the way that we want it to. So I'm going to go ahead and select tasks ID, select Louis, click run, and it's not working. Perfect. The next thing that we're going to explore is our subscriptions. So let's just do a quick recap of what we've done so far. Well, we have our to-do list. We've manipulated our queries here. We've grabbed our aggregate and then manipulated it so that we can get actually all of our tasks in a list form here that looks a lot like this, with our orders, with our title, all of the content that belongs. We've also introduced a method of being able to show active or show all. We've also introduced the ability to edit our tasks, delete our tasks, and complete our tasks. The next thing that we're going to want to do is subscribe to these tasks. Because once we've subscribed to these tasks, what's next? Well, when a task is completed, everybody that's subscribed to it should be sent an email. So we're going to explore Postmark and their API and triggers and going ahead and sending emails. So let's go ahead and dive into that. To get started, we're going to head to our database. And what I want to do is I want to create a new data table for holding who's subscribed to which task. So I'll add this table and I'll enter my data manually and I'll call this subscriptions. And we'll keep it just like this. You can, of course, always change your primary key type to be sequential or UUID, so on and so forth. We will add the basic CRUD endpoints to the default group and we can go ahead and add our table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add two table references. First off, who is the user that is subscribed, and another table reference to which task have they subscribed to. That's it. Next, what we could do is we can go ahead and click on this Show References button. And what we're going to do is head to this Post Subscriptions. First, we're going to want to ensure that this is authenticated, so only authenticated users can subscribe. After authenticated users can subscribe, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add this subscription based off of the user ID and the task ID. So if I wanted to go ahead and say that user 4 has subscribed to task ID 2, I can do that. I'll click run and I'll head to my subscription table where I should be able to see that Louis has subscribed to the second test task from the API. Perfect. From there, we have one additional thing that I'd like to do. I'd like to go ahead and delete a subscription. I have the idea here that a user can subscribe and unsubscribe if they don't want to be here. So we'll click this back button here. Under the subscriptions group, we'll just simply go to this delete. What we're going to want to do is just make sure that the user can delete what they need. We don't have any access controls for our subscriptions within our pre-middleware. And it's not always a bad thing. This app is lightweight enough that if we wanted to, we could absolutely go back into those controls and change them, but we also have the means of introducing preconditions here within this endpoint. So what we need to do first and foremost is we need to get our subscription. And we're getting our subscription because it's going to hold some information for us. So let's go ahead and get our subscription. And what are we actually searching? Well, we're passing in a subscription ID. So we're going to search the ID and we're going to use that subscription ID input to find the right record. Let's go ahead and move it up a little bit. We're also going to want to make sure that this is an authenticated endpoint because only the authenticated user should be able to adjust this endpoint. From there, what we want to do is we add a precondition. So let's go ahead and add our precondition here. And what we're checking is that our subscriptions1.user_ID equals the ID of the auth token. So let's go ahead and click save. And I'm just going to head to my subscriptions real quick and head to my output, make sure that that schema is right. So it is going to be, and we can change this to just subscription if you'd like and update our reference. So we have our subscription.user_ID, where in our precondition, we're just making sure that our subscription.user_ID equals the user who is authenticating. Otherwise, this user doesn't have access to perform this action. Cool. Copy and paste that into the payload. Error type will say unauthorized and click save. Otherwise, they do have permission and we can go ahead and then delete that record. So let's go ahead and run this real quick. I'm going to run this as Louis. Actually, I'll run this as Cam first and subscription ID of 1. I don't have the ability to subscribe, but if we change this to Louis and then click it, we do have the ability to delete that record. So you can see what is happening here is it's returning our subscription as it's found before it's deleted, which is fine. Of course, you can do that, but it's not advised. Instead, we should go ahead and introduce a custom status. So I like to do just status and deleted, but of course, Xano is so cool that you can change it to whatever you'd like and then have the front end respond appropriately. So we're just going to change that custom output to status is deleted, but we now have our subscription being able to be subscribed to and also removed. So the next thing that we have to do is think about, well, when a status or a task is completed, how do we send emails to everybody? How do we actually notify everybody all at once that this task has been completed? Good question. Well, what I've done behind the scenes is I've created a Postmark account. I've created a Postmark account and added a sender signature of my email so that I'm allowed to send emails, essentially. Of course, you can do more. You can add a domain or even more signatures. It's helpful definitely for authentication to ensure deliverability. Right now, just for this, we're going to proceed with just the single sender using my email. That's totally fine, but we're going to head to our servers and we're going to click on this default broadcast stream. So you can see that I've sent 7 emails in the last 30 days as I have been building this up, but we can also click on this setup instructions. When we come to our setup instructions, you can see here that we have this curl code. Very easy to import this curl code, but essentially all we need to do is pass this information and configure this information so that it sends an email to a user. Of course, fully customizable in your own way, but let's explore how to do that and where we set it up. What I want to do is I want to focus specifically on the tasks. So we have our completed or not completed. I want to use a trigger. Very cool feature. We can click on the settings in the top right or that little 3 dots and then select our triggers and add a database trigger. And what I'm going to call this is our send email notification. This sends emails to users who are subscribed to this task. And what I want to have happen is I want this to send emails when this record is updated. And specifically, I want it to do so when the new completed equals true. So when this record has been completed, we're going to send some emails. So what do we actually need to do first? Well, what I am going to do just to even get started is I'm just going to head back before I've done anything and click on the completed. Then I'm going to head back into my trigger. And inside my trigger, I'm going to go to my request history. I'm going to wait for this request history to show up. And if it does not show up, that's because you need to go to your settings. You need to go to your branch defaults and you need to go ahead and select trigger to enabled. So we'll go ahead and click that. And I'm just going to toggle this completed one more time and head back into my trigger where I'll go back to my request history. Refresh this, and eventually we should see our request history show up where things have happened. There isn't a thing that does happen inside this trigger, so that makes sense. But what I do know is that we want to go ahead and query all of our data from our subscriptions. So let's just go ahead and do that. There we go, our request history showed up in the meantime. And the reason I'm doing this is so I can grab my inputs. And what I want that for is so I can test inside my trigger. Instead of having to go back and forth, I can just trigger everything here and then click run. Now, there is no response in a trigger. So what we will do is add a stop and debug. Now I'll go ahead and return my subscriptions and I'll click run again. Louis been deleted from that subscription. So if we actually head back into our subscriptions and select, we'll use my email here. So this is task ID number 2 that we're going to be focusing on here. So if we go ahead and run this, you can see that this user information has been found. So here we have our subscription ID 2. Our user ID of 1 is subscribed to our task ID of 2. From there, what we're going to do is we're going to loop through this array for all of our users. Now, we are missing a little bit of information. We have our user, but we don't have their email. So let's click on our query all records and head to our output where we're going to add an add-on, and we'll create a new add-on for our user, single item, where we map the user ID. We'll just call it user. And we have our, I like to delete that underscore, and then we can customize our response because we don't need all of this information. So we only want that email returned. So we'll go ahead and select save and done and save. Once we have this, we can introduce a loop. So we have all of this data coming back, and it's going to be coming back like this with our user ID add-on. We'll go ahead and call the list. Well, we'll say that the list is our subscriptions, and we'll say each as is a user. What we want to do is introduce our external API request. So this is how we make that bridge between Xano and other third-party applications. We have this import curl setting in the top right, and we're just going to paste that curl code from Postmark, and we'll click import. Very quickly, we are now ready to send emails. But before we do that, I want to introduce some best practices. First off, we have this X Postmark server token. This is going to be our authentication so that Postmark allows us to use their service. What I'm going to do is I'm going to head to my settings, I'm going to go to manage, and I'm going to add an environment variable. I'm going to call this Postmark, and I'm going to paste that thing that I just copied, the header information. So the X Postmark server token. You can call it whatever you'd like, but make sure you save it. And heading back into your trigger, you just want to go back to where it exists inside that external API request. Find it within your environment dropdown and click update. Awesome. Don't need to do a whole lot more apart from change the to be the user that we're iterating over. So user, and before we do that, what I'd like to do, I'd like just to see what that actually looks like when we run and debug it to see the schema. So it's going to be our user that we're iterating over, .user, .email. So if we go ahead and re-enable this and head to our to, it'll be user, .user, .email, and click update and save. We should now expect an email to be sent to Cameron.b@xano.com. Before we do that, I'm going to drag my stop and debug inside my loop and return the response of API 1. So it's only going to loop over once, and we should see if it does send successfully. So if we click run, we can see here that error code 0, message OK to Cameron.b@xano.com. So it did send successfully. Status of 200 is always a good thing. Before we proceed any further and actually take a look at that email, we're going to do a couple more things. We're going to first change this text here. You can say, hello, dear user. You can also customize your user response to return their name, and then using tokenization, replace that name with their name. But we're just going to keep it simple here and say the task that you subscribed to has been completed, and click update and then save. What I also want to do is I want to ensure that this person doesn't get another email in the event that they have already received an email. For whichever reason, who knows, but we'll go to our database, we'll head to our subscriptions, and we're going to add a new column called sent, or email sent. It'll be a Boolean here, so we can go ahead and mark whether or not it has been sent, true or false. Back inside our subscriptions, I am going to change this custom query, where what I am going to be looking for is, first off, I need to find all of the users where the task ID equals the new .tasks_ID. And I can just double check the schema here because I believe that's it. No, it's actually just ID. My apologies. So we're going to ensure that it's new.id. So first off, we're finding all of the subscriptions that belong to this particular task. And we want to make sure that the email sent equals false because we don't want to send it to a person who's already received this email. And very lastly, promise, we're about to test this. Under step 2.1 or under our API response, we are going to edit that subscription record. So that would be field name of ID. Well, it's actually going to be we're calling it user. We're just going to call it user.id. So maybe we do want to change the name that we're iterating over in our subscription list and call it just sub. I think that is going to help clarify. So we have our sub, and it's going to have the ID. So we're going to say that we're modifying our sub.id, and the email sent will be true as the last step in this loop. I'll delete my stop and debug, but we have our query all records from subscriptions. We're going to loop through all the subscriptions and call it a sub. We're then going to send an email using postmark, and we've also updated that postmark environment variable. And then after it's been sent successfully, we're going to then change that email sent to true and click save. We're going to want to make sure that we have subscriptions before we send anything. So let's just go ahead and ensure that Cameron here can be sent emails regarding both the second ID and the third ID. And we can also just double check that our tasks. So this is a second task, and we can say third task here. So we have distinction, and we'll head back to our subscription, and it did update. That's what I wanted to ensure. But now what we could do is we can head to our tasks, and we can say that they've been completed. So if they've been completed, we should be able to go to our subscriptions and see that the emails have sent. Awesome. So that trigger is working so far. But what does the email look like here? So heading to our email, we are going to see that we have received an email that these tasks have been completed. Now, the sender hasn't authenticated this message. So using postmark, I hadn't gone over. I said, we're proceeding with single sender verification. There are better ways to ensure that it's always delivered outside of your spam inbox. But for the sake of this example, we have the ability to send emails using this curl information because of the trigger that we had set up. So ultimately, what we have done is we've queried all of our data. We've manipulated our data. We've set a toggle switch to ensure that our data can be shown whether it's completed or not. We've added the subscribe feature that allows a user to subscribe to a particular task. We've also modified or checked out the ability to edit a task and delete a task, as well as complete a task, so that when we do complete a task, we send emails to any user who has subscribed. This edited to-do page is, of course, just sort of an example of what you would show your users when you're editing a task, but we had also, building off of this pencil icon, shown a way how to do so successfully without a lot of work. What we've done here is created a system that lets you take what you've learned and build something greater and more grand. This to-do app is fairly simple. A great introduction as to what Xano allows you to do with add-ons, customizing your endpoints, customizing your responses, being able to shape the data the way that you want. Now, the only other thing that sort of exists beyond just creating this is launching it. So I'd love to see anybody who has followed this step by step and maybe even added their own. I'd love to see what it looks like attached to a front end. That would be so cool to be able to see. But this to-do app here, functionality-wise, is going to let you do exactly what you want. Let me know if you have any other questions, comments, or concerns about what we have gone over. I'd love to be able to answer any questions. And of course, if you have anything to say, you can throw it in the community, or you can also reach out to our support chat within Intercom. But thanks so much for being a part of this awesome journey. It's been awesome building this to-do app with you guys, and I expect many more like this to come. Thanks.